Welcome everyone to the First Name Basis podcast. I'm your host, Sheetal Jaitly, the CEO of TribalScale. Here is where I bring people who I find doing really cool stuff in the world of tech and innovation. And with me today, I got a good friend. I always seem to have a good friend, but here today I got a really special friend of mine. Her name is Dr. Sarah Saska. She's the CEO and co-founder of Feminuity. Sarah, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me. So glad to be here.
I'm so glad to have you on. This is something that we've been planning for months. I'm glad we found time in our busy schedule to do this. And you've been extremely busy more recently, and we're going to get to that. And let's talk about why that's happening. But tell us a little bit about yourself. Would love our listeners to get to know you a little more, just like I know you.
Yeah, totally. And so, I can't compete with the radio voice that you have. So
I
I'm
got a
sorry,
Hollywood
y'all.
face. This also goes on video, all right?
So hi all. My name is Sarah. My pronouns are she and her. I'm the co-founder and CEO of an organization called Feminuity. So years ago now, when I was in my PhD, I was poking around and doing some research. And I learned that car accidents are the leading cause of death related to maternal trauma. So, translation, when someone who is pregnant gets into a car crash, there's a really, really high likelihood that they'll lose their unborn fetus. And I was really struck by this, right? I wanted to know why. I wanted to know what the heck was going on. And so it turned out that car crash safety testing was done using male-bodied crash test dummies as the default or the norm.
Right.
And so this practice comes from wartime, right? When men were the ones predominantly behind the wheel.
Yeah.
But, if we fast forward to present day, this means that anyone who deviates from 180 pound sort of male frame is less safe in a vehicle. So this is really very much a deep-seated gender-related bias, size-related bias that stems from the automotive industry.
Which is causing a lot of hurt and pain for many people because that's not the norm, right?
Totally.
Like, obviously you drive, I'm not even 180 pounds, I drive. But definitely like a pregnant female is something that needs the utmost safety, especially the way our society views pregnant women, right? Like we want to make sure that everything is taken care of and they're kept safe for the health of the child.
For sure. Yeah. And when I was in grad school and looking at the research at the time, even Tesla, right, like a player that's considered to be wildly disruptive, was using male body crash test dummies as their norm, right? So if it was happening in the automotive industry and players like Tesla were not sort of questioning this practice, it made me wonder, what the heck is going on in other sort of areas of the tech and innovation sector? Where were the gaps? Where were the biases? Like, where were the blind spots, right?
Right.
So, I looked around in lots of places, right, and found a range of things, right, from facial recognition software that didn't detect racialized people's faces properly or weren't able to distinguish between Asian people's faces, to natural language processing that doesn't recognize different types of dialects, right, that really considered that North American sort of accent as the default or the norm.
Sure.
And then to things that are even scarier, like risk assessment algorithms that disproportionately assign high crime risk scores to Black people and Black communities.
So you saw all these like issues happening out there, and you're in the middle of your PhD, and you start like realizing, hey, there's a large segment of this population beyond just pregnant females that are completely being left out of products and services that are being offered to everyone. And so what was like the light bulb that went in your head? Like, what did you say? You said, okay, what am I going to go and do?
Yeah, I think just in the middle of my PhD, I was just like, okay, so who's dealing with this? Like, who's sort of solving for this problem? And to me, I didn't see anyone really thinking about it in the way that that I was thinking about at the time. So I put my PhD on pause. I joined Marge's Discovery District in their fellowship, like their innovation accelerator program for a year.
Okay.
And the research ultimately became the inspiration for Feminuity.
Wow. So that's a big thing for you to say, hey, I'm doing this PhD and I'm actually going to put it on pause. Like you have that entrepreneurial bug. You're like, I got a big problem I found that I want to go solve.
Totally. And academics didn't know what the heck to do with me, right? Because a lot of academics, not that many academics have sort of started a thing, right?
Right,
Many kind of
right,
came up in the ivory tower and, don't peek their heads out too
right,
often. So
right.
I was definitely the black sheep.
Okay. So then you went to Mars and you went to, sorry, you said you went somewhere else too.
No, I spent a year there,
Okay.
and that's where we were backed and launched in the early days.
Okay. So how did you say, hey, I'm gonna actually turn this into a business? Because there's always a big stretch for an entrepreneur to say, hey, found this problem. How do I turn this into a solution that's actually going to become a business? Especially when nobody's looking for it, nobody's even asking for it. But you have found a big issue.
I think for me, it was just really stubborn. I was just like, I know this is a problem. I'm quantifying it. I'm
Yeah.
seeing different examples pop up, and this was also really at a time where the tech and innovation sectors were really on their come up,
What year
especially
was
in North
this?
America.
Because if you think about it in
Gosh,
today's time, you definitely realize,
yeah.
oh, there's a huge need for what Sarah does. But I think you got to put it into context as to when this was happening.
Yeah, so this is around 2010, so
Okay.
a good decade ago now. Yeah, when
Okay.
everything was sort of, in motion to sort of start.
Sure. Awesome. Okay. So you go through the program. What did you start noticing? Like as you started building Femininity, like what were some of the challenges that came in front of you, and how did you start finding opportunities for you to actually provide a service to customers?
Well, I think at a really high level, one of the biggest learnings was just how ill-equipped academics or like graduate programs leave academics to actually jump into entrepreneurship. I think that's definitely changed since then, right? Now that universities really want people to translate their research into practice, but
Hmm.
I had to learn how to say things in more simple terms, right? I couldn't submit a 200-page document to make my
Yeah,
case, right?
for
So
sure.
mastering that sort of elevator pitch and translating the research into practice was a pretty steep learning curve. Um,
So, I mean, we're talking a decade, so you've obviously did like seen a lot and done a lot as you're doing it. What was it like to like start figuring out like when you were a pre-revenue startup or even started speaking to some other startups saying, hey, these are things you need to be considering. And, especially when you're talking to startups, they're like, I got to run a million miles an hour. I don't even know what you're talking about right now. Right? Like, how did you break through that wall of communication and be like, hey, we're actually here to solve a major problem, and we're going to give you, I believe firmly, you give insight into the blinders that most people have when they're working in the business
yeah, it was really interesting because being in the Canadian context, like as a Toronto founded Canadian startup at the time, I thought we would have lots of interest from Canadian tech, like the Canadian innovation sector, but we didn't. It's almost like Canadian tech really likes to talk about the fact that diversity is our strength, right?
world.
Anytime things are
Yeah, yeah.
going a little bit, getting a bit weird south of the border, right? Like the
We're
Canadian
like, oh,
tech
we're
likes to
Canada,
say,
we're
"Hey,
different.
come
Yeah, yeah,
here."
yeah.
Yeah. But that's something that really we need to call bullshit on, right? Like
Okay.
we scream it from the rooftops, but actually the Canadian tech sector, at least at that time, no one was willing to put their money where their mouth is and actually do any of this work in an intentional way. The idea was because we have such a diverse population in Toronto and in Canada that therefore we're just good. Like that somehow
Mm.
that would translate, into industry, and that wasn't happening. So our first client, well, my first client was, the Vietnamese government doing policy work on their innovation and entrepreneurship policy.
So it
And
didn't come from Canada.
no, and then I was in
Okay.
Sri Lanka and Jordan and India working in the garment manufacturing sector. And then in China, and Japan, and then the Valley, and then in time we made our way to Canada. And I mean, now we have,
Why do you think that? I have my own, and I mean, for those listeners who listen to this podcast, I have my own thoughts on why it's so hard to start out here in Canada. But what was like, why do you feel that happened for you?
I don't know. I really still think that people hide behind the whole diversity is their strength here. And so therefore they think they don't actually have problems or like they don't need to do the work. Um, that's I guess that's sort of been my working hypothesis. But what's your thought on that?
My thought on that is that Canadians are so risk adverse, and
Yeah.
they always want to see a proven blueprint somewhere else before they go ahead and take the first step. And when you're going into an area that's considered super new, and we get up there and scream from the rooftops that we're multicultural and we don't have a problem, that they were just, well, we don't, like, they still had their blinders on until they actually go
Yeah.
and see real life problems that have come out there. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the stuff you found
Mhm.
beyond just the car manufacturer issue that we were talking about. I mean, you talked a little about natural language processing and facial recognition, but like there's some pretty big case studies out there right now of companies that are really effed up, right? So let's get to the mission of Femininity. What's the mission of the company right now?
I'd say, since day one, our mission has really held true. We've always looked to make better things, like products that are ethical and inclusive and accessible, and that actually meet the needs of a diverse and global customer base.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond making better things, we also want to make things better for everyone, right? And when we say everyone, we mean everyone. So we want to do that through the types of technologies and innovations that we build, and also through the design of the workplaces, right? What does that UX, that lived experience, look like on any given day when you're working within an organization, right? We don't want workplaces where people sort of have to survive them on any given day. We want places where people can actually thrive.
Awesome. So I mean, it's two-folded, right? And I think this was one of the big eye openers when I first met you and we started talking. It wasn't just about how do you hire a diverse workforce, how do you even go out of your comfort zone and making your place more inclusive. Everybody kind of thinks of their own people when it comes to this, but it's really how are you going to build a proper ethical product? And if you look in today's world, like this conversation about ethical design and ethical productization is becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, and companies like Facebook are probably the easiest ones to pick on because everybody uses the product and sees so many issues with it. So we've witnessed a huge change in the last couple of months, and it really started stemming from diversity, inclusive motivations that people have to actually go and be more inclusive. But really, it was, we're in COVID and Black Lives Matter hits us, right? The death of George Floyd was like a huge eye opener, saying we can't just sit back and be like, hey, let's ignore this problem. We actually have to really stand up and fight for solving this problem, because change is just not going to happen on its own. So talk to me a little bit about like what's been happening since that whole movement has happened in the past 6 or 7 months.
Well, I'd say like the last 6, 7 months have been a ride. Definitely a journey not for the faint of heart. I'd say like at the start of COVID, the COVID-19 pandemic, in about March or so, in the D&I space, diversity inclusion space, we witnessed our pipeline pretty much evaporate overnight. We saw, across North America, we saw chief diversity officers or people in related roles get laid off. Individual
So this was like the
practitioners.
first budget to get cut
Oh
when the
gosh,
pandemic
yeah,
hit, right? Like
totally. Yeah,
they
what
thought
besides like your
they thought
SNAP budget?
this is a nice to have. We don't need it, which is probably the opposite.
Totally. Yeah, and I would
Yeah.
argue that
Yeah.
in the midst of a global pandemic, you actually need this type of support more than ever before,
Right.
especially with, organizations that were shifting to become wholly remote for the first time ever. Like accessibility issues just like came to the surface in a way that we'd never could have predicted.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we saw budgets just get wiped out, practitioners laid off, CDOs at like some of the largest corporations around the world lose their job overnight. But we still had tons and tons of inbound requests because people were struggling. Like people needed resources, they needed support, and it was so much of it was pro bono, and we were totally cool with that. From my perspective, I didn't take a salary. I committed to our whole team, hey, I'm going to keep everybody on and honor all of our commitments.
Sure.
And we just said we're going to be supportive. We're just going to support orgs in real time, right? Because that's what we're here for, and we did that.
But there's a fine line, right, Sarah, to that. I think, one of the frustrations I see from hanging out with you and going out with you is anytime you meet another executive, all they want to do is like get brain drained from you because they just want free advice all the time, right? And there's got to be a balance as to like, when does that stop? And I know you're a generous nature. You're like, hey, I got to go and support you no matter what, right? And that's something that you always do. But how does one in the situation in the pandemic? I know you stepped up to help these organizations out, but at what point do you say, hey, I can't keep investing in you without eating myself?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I'm a saver, right? So I've always made sure we always have a good runway. Like
Hmm.
we can always sustain ourselves for a year, year and a half or so as an organization. Um, I mean, in my perfect world, all of this work is just, completely open source. But at the same time, like wanting to balance the tension to get organizations to understand this is real work. Like this is a real skill set. You cannot just make it up on the fly,
Sure.
right? You can't just like we're in real time. We're watching so many folks get appointed to CDO roles for the first time without any background or expertise in the field, and they are spiraling.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's definitely a tension. We'll always be really generous with sharing whatever we can, open sourcing resources, that sort of thing. Um, but we're getting better. We're getting better, and we're also
Yeah.
sort of teaching corporations that this is real work. And I think they're in the last few months they're starting to get that.
So yeah, I mean, but it's odd, right? Like we're talking about, hey, demand has gone through the roof, and at the same time, budgets have gone down, and so it's it, it's a weird storm to be in.
It's a super weird storm. Yeah, I'd say like after the day after the murder of George Floyd, we saw our inbound requests shoot up by over 800%, and
Wow.
that has actually sustained for the past 4 months. Like our inbound has never quieted because of all that was happening at the start of COVID and the ways people were struggling, but then it shot up even more so with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement for sure.
And okay, so what are like some of the requests that they're seeing? Like, what are they asking of you? What are some things you share with the people who are flooding you with these requests?
Definitely a lot of requests for training, like educational endeavors, like foundational conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, allyship, that sort of thing. Anything that's related to, say, anti-Black racism or anti-Indigenous racism, for example, we refer out to practitioners. Certainly, a lot of requests around that.
Hmm.
But one of the things I'm really glad to see is that organizations have been really intentional about wanting to do assessments. So really fulsome, like 360 um, assessments of their orgs. That's been another pretty significant request.
Sure. Yeah, I know my mom was she was doing a survey the other day. I won't mention the company she works for, but she was doing a survey the other day and she's like, never in my whole career of over 40 years have I been asked these questions about like, have
Yeah.
I ever felt I was in a situation where I've been stereotyped against? She's like, why are they only waking up to ask me this now? I really needed them years ago. And I sat her down and said, hey, there's a real movement now where I figure out, is this like where the problems lie within your large organization, and this is a safe place for you to actually tell the truth. So you should continue doing that. Um, so assessments are one thing, and then how do you go about like helping afterwards? I think that's where the hard part and the real work really starts, right? Not to say that that's not real work, but now that you got a problem in these areas, how do you go about fixing it? So like what are some of the tools and things you use to start helping an organization get back on the right path?
Yeah. So once we've done a really fulsome assessment of an organization, right, we have their quantitative data, their qualitative, we've reviewed their supplementary pieces. Um, we share a really robust findings report with a whole range of recommendations. And then if the organization already has a chief diversity officer and like a fulsome team, which in the US is very much the norm, in Canada, Shopify is the only Canadian tech company that has the equivalent of a CDO and fulsome team. Like that's how
Okay.
different those markets are. Yeah.
Wow.
But once we have a really fulsome assessment, then we either work with their embedded leads or we help them design like a D&I council of sorts
Hmm.
that's representative of the organization from different departments, levels of seniority, skills, expertise, that sort of thing. And we go through a co-design process with them where we take all the data, we take all the inputs, and we actually develop a really feasible strategy with them. And then we run it, we draw an agile methodology, and we run that council, that group in sprints, and we get shit done.
I like it.
We speak their language.
But the cool thing is, like, we're working with you, like an organization actually gets hard deliverables, like whether it be your assessment or then you running these programs in this council. And all, if you're running an agile methodology, it's like, hey, we're delivering and we're iterating and we're getting better and better as we go along, which is really, really, really cool. One of the things that I hear, over a beer, it's usually another dude, and I'm sitting with at a bar, and I know you've heard it with me too, because it's said openly, but not as openly, but saying, hey, I think we're over-indexing. We're over-indexing the wrong way. What do you say to that?
Do you mean like in terms of like over-indexing on gender, or like?
Yeah, we're like this whole, like, even on like the Black Lives Matter thing or anything, whenever we start talking about diversity or inclusion or equal rights or gay rights or whatever it may be, I think those are the two common quote unquote things I hear from people who just don't want to put the effort into making it better, right? I think it's like they say, hey, we're over-indexing. What is a good rebuttal back to that? I know I got mine. I mean, I start sharing our personal experiences of what we've gone through. But I would, like, what does someone like you say to them?
Yeah, I mean, if they're talking about like we're just, the organization is just over-indexing by just like doing too much as it relates to diversity inclusion related efforts, that's one thing. But if their critique is a bit more specific, like we're over-indexing on advancing women within our organization, or we're really, really focused on the conversation pertaining to racial inequity right now,
Mm-hmm.
then I'm kind of two minds, right? Like, absolutely, from the perspective of social justice, like we know that at certain times in the world we need to center particular conversations because certain people are hurting, right? So that's very much why Black Lives Matter and all lives matter is certainly should
Very
not be the
different.
conversation. However, in the context of the workplace, the field of diversity and inclusion is about balancing the needs of everyone, right? So the queer community, racialized folks living with different types of disabilities, newcomers, immigrants, like everybody. And so I do think that whenever in the context of an organization, we've seen it with the really significant push around women in tech. Whenever you focus on sort of only one particular group, you leave a lot of others behind. So I actually am not a huge proponent of women first or gender first approaches to this work. I think you need to take a deeply intersectional lens, right? That we're balancing the needs of many and working to advance everything around ability as much as we are around gender and race, sort of simultaneously. So
That's like what you just said there is like not what you hear many say, right? It's a very different type of opinion of like looking at it from a completely different lens of saying, hey, I think what we got to do is look at a much larger problem here of how we can make it more fair for all, rather than just one sub of that problem, right?
Totally. Like if we look to the early days of Lean In, right? Like Sheryl Sandberg's initiative, right? That she launched years ago now. Lean In ultimately, there were Lean In circles and initiatives that happening across workplaces all over North America, and I'm sure well beyond. But ultimately, those initiatives, at least in the early days, really only supported white women, like white, cisgender, probably heterosexual, non-disabled women, right? They did not properly support a whole range of other women.
Sure.
And so that sucks, right? Like that's not the move. And in fact, I feel like we're cleaning up in a lot of the work we do. We clean up for a lot of those efforts, right? Because there's been so many, racialized women, queer women, like other women who've been left behind. But so that's why for us, like gender first, women only, nope, not the way to go. We absolutely use an intersectional approach to how we approach our work.
All right. So you see this uptick in D&I efforts everywhere. Is it all being good, bad, something in between? What are you seeing? What are the trends happening in the industry right now?
Yeah, I mean, we've absolutely had a ton of knee-jerk reactions, right? We've had organizations reply on emails of proposals that we sent like a year and a half, 2 years ago, overnight, and then want to start yesterday.
Yeah.
So it's a really good lesson as an entrepreneur. Hey, always put dates on your proposals, right? Those prices that you sent 2 years ago, nope, those don't apply now.
And
But
I mean,
so
even now with your demand, I mean, you just even, I'm so happy you're able to take an hour out of your time and spend it with me right now. But like your calendar is just packed, right? So you can't be discounting your work and your effort if it's not for the right reason.
totally, yeah. Um, so lots of knee-jerk reactions, lots of organizations that are still looking for that like one and done sort of tick box kind of effort. So in real time, we've had to get really intentional about our intake process, right? We've become very particular about the organizations that we choose to take on, because we certainly cannot,
I
we can't
love
say
it.
yes
So
to all.
are you interviewing clients? Like it's the other way around. They're not interviewing you. You're actually interviewing them if they'd be ready for someone like yourself and your team to go work with them.
Totally. We have a pretty intensive intake process now, and then a really sort of robust like referral process. So sometimes, different projects just actually don't really play to our strengths as well. So we also
Mhm.
refer those out.
Okay.
But if organizations are really doing something in a knee jerk sort of tokenistic
Yeah,
manner,
if they just
we
need
don't
to
want to be
get that
part of it.
checklist and say, "Hey, we did it. Like, look, we did this. So everybody, just stop. We're moving on."
Totally.
That's not for you.
No, it's not at our core. It doesn't feel right for us. It's also a great way to ruin our brand, right? We're
Yeah,
we're
of course.
very about quality and integrity. So um,
Cool.
but so, and then there's also been a lot of organizations, I think some feel like they're scared, in like some are scared into a corner for sure. And then there's lots who actually are like, you know what, we've wanted to do this for a long time. Finally we have the buy-in, finally the budget has like, reappeared, and there's a lot that are really digging in and doing the work in a really awesome way right now. So that's awesome.
Let me
But we're
check.
also
One thing you said is like some are just scared into a corner. If they were scared into a corner, were they that dumb they didn't realize they had a problem before?
I think it's
I think
just
like
sort of
if
like
you're being scared into the corner now, it's only because people are speaking up. But the root of the problem is probably always there.
totally, it's always been there. Yeah. Um, when CEOs come to me and say like, oh gosh, like one of our former employees or employee like took to Twitter, right? And now they're just like they're bashing our organization on Twitter. Usually once we actually dig in and talk about it a little bit more, that person actually tried to bring that feedback up to their manager, to other people on their team, or to that CEO or that leader in different ways. And there just wasn't a pathway. Like no one was hearing them. They weren't being listened to.
Right.
And then, in this political climate, a lot of folks feel like, you know what, screw it.
I think, yeah.
I'm going to share what's right for me. So more often than not, I don't find people, people don't go straight to like putting people on blast. They don't go straight to Twitter, right? They usually do try a lot of other
Yeah.
channels.
And I mean, putting like going out and putting yourself out there in a social way, like on Twitter, those people who are going and doing that are probably risking a lot themselves because they know like the
Absolutely.
blow, like that is not a comfortable position to be in.
No, no. That's why I think for many folks, it really sincerely feels like a last resort, right? Like that they're not being heard, and it's pretty critical to them. So, and I think once leaders start to understand through that frame, they tend to soften, right? And that's usually when we can help them to build a bridge, right, and have a real conversation.
For sure. So we also were talking about there's a lot of technologies coming out now that
Yeah.
are supposed to help you solve these problems. And one of the things I know when you and I were chatting about this podcast last week, we were like, sometimes the technology or product you're implementing is already biased and is doing actually you probably more of a disservice than good. So like, A, let's talk about like some of the technologies that are out there. And then B, if you are going to be like looking for a technology solution to this problem, what you should be looking for.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Like the rise of diversity inclusion in tech is pretty wild right now. These technologies are looking at everything from who gets hired to who gets fired. Technologies are determining who can even see a job ad in the first place. They're playing with who gets paid and how much, and who gets promoted. So it's a lot.
Yeah.
Um, and like anecdotally, I can tell you, like I've been asked by probably a dozen VCs in the last few months to either advise on their latest D&I technology effort or like we've been offered money, and largely because they want us to build out a platform, right? They want us to take our existing sort of research centered, consulting centered IP and build into some platform that they can monetize and scale. And I get it, right? It's intuitively appealing to look to technology to support D&I efforts, for sure. And I also have a ton of empathy for the fact that there's so many organizations who want to do this work, have the political pressure going to do this work, but they're also super cash strapped, and especially with the impending second wave, like that's real. Like I totally understand that. Like third party consultants, yeah, they're expensive. They're a cost, right?
Sure.
So, but really, like I really take major issue, like at the heart of the work that we do, right? We know that we need to be really intentional and careful with how we build, design, and leverage technologies in the first place. And so trying to solve diversity, equity, and inclusion challenges, right? Challenges that are deeply complex and deeply human-centered with technology is very much at odds for me. And there was one VC that called me a Luddite when I turned down their offer to build a platform. And it was a really funny moment for me. Because I think like the understanding of the word itself, Luddite, is for those who are deemed to be out of touch with technology, or they have a disdain for technology, but that's not really accurate. So the origin of the actual word, so there was an iconic revolt against machines with a group of folks, English textile workers in 19th century England. And ultimately what they were doing is they were protesting the social cost of technological process at the time, largely those that were impacting working class folks, that they were sort of being forced to accept. And so this group, the Luddites, they were concerned ultimately with how machinery was being rolled out without any consideration for the negative impact on people and on society more broadly. So I think this history reinforces the fact that we need to be a lot more careful and a lot more democratic in our approach to technology, right? We need to, to think about ethics and justice in how we design it and build it. So with that VC calling me a Luddite, it makes me laugh. Like, yeah, I am a Luddite because I deeply care and I deeply love technology, but I think we need to be really careful with it.
So there's a couple things I just want to touch on there. Do you see a day where where your research and frameworks would be able to be leveraged by technology, and you would be able to say, hey, almost like the American Standard Association, be like, hey, this has the Femininity stamp of approval. We've actually, have vetted this to actually with our research and with what we know to actually roll out. So that's, I guess, my first question. Like, do you see a world where you're going to be on the right path to go do that?
I see major need for M&As in the D&I and HR tech space. Because right now, a lot of our clients, what we find is that there's a lot of good things coming from a lot of different types of tools. However, the average organizations who actually is trying to be really intentional with this, they're on like 10 to 12 different platforms, which are all doing one small piece of the puzzle. And so that's a pain. So in my mind, it's less about needing lots of new tech. It's about bringing some of the really awesome, solid ones together under one roof.
Okay.
Right. So I think it's because it's a field in its infancy, right? It's that we're seeing, all these sort of startups trying to solve for like one small piece of it, when realistically, that's a pain, right? Who wants to have 12 subscriptions when you could have one?
I like it. Before we get into some like case studies type stuff, I'm gonna take a pause here from talking about diversity and inclusion. I'm gonna throw some fastball questions at you, whatever.
Okay.
I've been doing this with everyone just so we get to know you better. So I'm gonna make it really easy for you with the first one. What's your favorite food?
My favorite food? Anything with olives.
Anything with olives? Not the steak I made you?
That was pretty good. And Gordon's still chewing on the bone from that tomahawk,
bone?
but
Yeah. If you could travel anywhere in the world right now, where would you go?
In real time right now, gosh, I'd take anywhere that a plane would take me right now. Let's say Maldives.
The Maldives, I like it. You want to go on the beach in that crystal blue water.
And before it, disappears and goes under with climate change.
Oh, don't say that. Don't say that. I still haven't been. I'm dying to go. All right. What's your favorite movie?
Favorite movie? I don't know. Can I go TV show?
Sure. Give a
Schitt's Creek. So
Schitt's Creek.
proud.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And last but not least, I want to promote a small business. What's a restaurant you want to go promote? Where would you go eat and bring your friends to go eat?
Gosh. Oh, there's this Indigenous owned restaurant. I think it's on Dundas or Adelaide. Gosh, the name escapes me right now, but I can get back to you on it.
All right. Google it before we're done. You got to plug it. All right. Let's get back. So I wanted to go, you and I, in preparing for the podcast, talked about a couple of examples of like what's happened. And one of them was with Amazon. You want to walk us through your Amazon example that we were discussing?
Yeah, I think Amazon's AI resume screening tool really, really speaks to why D&I tech is really a complex field, right? That needs to be
Sure.
taken really seriously. So, I mean, this was all over the news maybe a year and a half or so ago. But so in an attempt to solve the problem of bias and discrimination in recruitment, and the whole process sorting through job applications, Amazon built an AI resume screening tool, right? They want something more objective, more efficient. But what they noticed really quickly was that the system is screening out resumes from women. And so even if a resume had women's chess club or women's college or something like that, indicated in the copy
And
that
it
the
was the
resumes were.
AI that was just naturally doing that. Like it just started doing that because I guess it was taking human behavior and trying to mimic that. Like why did that start happening?
It was because of the data, like the training sets that they use for the machine learning. So the classic sort of expression, right? Garbage in, garbage out, right? Like
Yeah.
the data sets that they had from years prior were that of resumes largely from men,
Sure.
right? So that was the data set that they trained
It's AI off
the
of.
ML. Exactly. Yeah. And so, Amazon was really vocal about this. They were very quick to actually scrap the tool. And they were kind of the first to admit that, as such a well-resourced company, they were pretty frank about saying you cannot engineer objectivity, right? So they won't touch this. They're not using this. They're not doing this. And yet in real time, we're watching small startups be funded by Canadian VCs who are trying to mimic the same technology. So explain that to me. I don't know.
Wow. And for a company like Amazon, who we think, has this evil master plan to take over the world, and let's face it, they are taking over the world. But like for them to public, this is something they could have brushed under the rug and like just been like, let's not talk about it. Let's go back to how we used to do things. But they publicly came out and said, hey, we fucked up. Like we gotta tell the world, hey, this is a system that's not necessarily going to work. And here's our lessons learned.
Totally. Yeah.
You got more. Give me more examples.
Well, I think another thing that's really kind of coming up in the D&I tech, like HR tech right now, are things like ZipRecruiter. So what we're learning, right, is that bias can occur before someone even applies for a job. So ZipRecruiter or other job boards, they help us to understand recruiter preferences and to actually solicit applications to match with them. And these systems are set up to make predictions based on patterns and user behavior, and they update dynamically as employers and job seekers interact. But so if a recruitment practice has a pre-existing bias, such as say an organization hiring predominantly say white men, then the algorithm will actually look for proxies of these characteristics. So they'll end up replicating these patterns in their recommendations.
Yeah.
So in this sense, this is actively contributing to the exclusion of other groups. So a lot of folks just won't be considered for these opportunities. They won't see these jobs in the first place.
Yeah. I mean, how do you even solve a problem if they can't even see it to apply?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, All right. Well, the next one you want to talk a little bit about pay equity?
Yeah, so increasingly we're seeing a lot of folks try to sort of solve the problem of pay inequity through D&I or HR related tech. But once we know is that, like, what we know ultimately is that if a data set shows that women are often paid less money than, say, men, or if white women are often paid more than, say, racialized women
Mm-hmm.
within that organization, then the algorithm will identify this pattern or these types of patterns and perpetuate these pay inequities in the offer that it actually proposes to candidates. And what's even more worrying is that because of under the guise of like objectivity, because these recommendations are coming from a tech platform, that people themselves aren't questioning them, right? It's just sort of an oversight,
Yeah.
which means that
They're like, oh, the
organizations
system, this is what the system told me to do, so I just did it. Like, there is no bias in it, but yet the system's being biased on its own.
totally, and
Yeah.
this can totally circumvent like laws that actually protect equal or equitable pay. So it's really counterintuitive.
Okay. And we were talking earlier about facial recognition. Like, what's a good example of like the facial recognition issues that we're seeing?
Yes, I mean there's so many big, complex, messy ones right now, right, as it relates to China and beyond. But in the context of the workplace, one that's really interesting and seemingly innocuous is that of Zoom, right? So just this past week, there was a professor who was on a Zoom call, I believe, with another professor, and the one guy was a white guy and the other guy was a racialized man, a black man, and his face, literally his head was literally cut off in the Zoom screen when he actually used one of the backgrounds. So this is a
Yeah,
problem. Like, we noticed this at the top of COVID once we really started to use Zoom a lot more.
sure.
That whenever someone would use a background on our team, that some of the folks in our team are racialized, that their faces would like
Yeah, you
blotch
start
out.
blurring out. You start
Yeah,
becoming the background. Yeah.
exactly. Like, I suspect you might end up experiencing that, right?
Yeah. I
So,
mean, luckily for me, it's been working okay, but it happens. It does
and I
happen
think, I mean, lighting, all these things kind of come into play.
for sure.
Um, but I mean, so there's, things like that, which just, Zoom has not figured out yet. But also what we've also noticed is that there's been an increasing rise in like companies wanting to like monitor people, right? There's a lot of leaders out there who simply don't trust this work from home model yet, right? And they think that people aren't being productive, all those kind of things. And a lot of companies have started to use different types of um, like monitoring, surveillance, like facial recognition type software to actually monitor their people while they work. So
Really?
there's, yes.
What if you, if like, I'm of the belief that if you can't trust the person who you've hired to actually get the job done, then why are they working with you? Right? It doesn't make sense. I know us at TribalScale, I feel we're on the opposite end of that spectrum where I feel like because we've been at home, we're being overworked. We gotta, I just, before we jumped on this podcast, we had this thing called Coffee Buddies, and it's like you jump on a Zoom with someone else, and you don't talk about work, you just talk about everything else in life. And like, it's important to go and start taking breaks. I feel it's going the other way, but I can't even imagine trying to say, hey, we're implementing this facial recognition software that's going to monitor you at your laptop or at your desk and make sure you're working. It's pretty big brother and stupidish.
Totally. And there's actually algorithms that are being used to assess workers' competence via looking at things like micro expressions that people display when they're asked a question, for example. And these types of algorithms have already shown to interpret emotions differently by race, as one example, right? Because a lot of facial recognition software really struggles with racialized people's faces with darker skin tones still. So it's super problematic.
Yeah, one of the things, I won't mention the bank, but I was talking to a very, very large US bank. And one of the things they said is they're actually afraid right now to let their machine learning and AI go loose because, and they use the example you and I were talking about over the weekend, which was the Apple Card, right? Like the algorithm went ahead and gave the husband in the relationship, twice the amount of credit as they did his wife, and she was the breadwinner in the family. right? Because this algorithm, as you've been talking so much about, has had this bias. What should these organizations do in that case? Like they know they have a need for machine learning and AI to play a role in their organization to help speed up and create better consumer experiences. But at the same time, now they're scared to do it. It's like, what should they be doing?
Well, I mean, I much prefer those who are unnerved about it, right? And less cavalier. Um, I think there's a bunch of different things we can do, right? One is really just getting beyond the idea that because something is sort of like a tech and innovation, that it's necessarily objective, right? Like we need to sort of get rid of that fairy tale, right? That technologies are more objective than people. And we really need to unearth like the process behind it, right? That ultimately, these solutions rely on data that's our historic data, right? Data of
Sure.
our histories as humans,
Yeah.
that reflects all of the good, all of the bad, everything in between. And that they're also then in real time shaped by us as humans, right? How we interact with them, like the questions that you type into Google search, right? All of these things
Right.
shape them in real time. So I think like lifting that guise of objectivity and understanding that really it's just people who shape the products, and that it's ultimately up to us. Um, Also, I think making sure that you have a really diverse team, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's certainly not enough to worry about like gender parity when it comes to these teams, right? I don't really care about gender parity anymore. I want to see teams that are, filled with folks who are newcomers and immigrants and folks with different types of disabilities and trans folks.
Mm-hmm.
Like get beyond the gender conversation, right? Like there's so many other people who are missing at any given table. And the better and the more robust of a team that you can build, I think you have a better shot, right, at data and training sets that are more robust, more thoughtful, more diverse. Perhaps never wholly objective, but you'll have a better shot at it. And then having guidelines, right, ethical standards around like how
Sure.
we even conduct these processes in the first place.
So, what are some tactical stuff that you think or an organization should have? I know some of the points you gave me was like take a look at your job descriptions, take a look at your hiring practices, and what that flow looks like. Even your communication out on social and everything you do. What are some tactical things that organizations should start doing like tomorrow? They don't even need to call you; they should just be able to implement these things.
Like orgs that are looking to be more thoughtful around
Yeah,
diversity inclusion generally, and not just like in their product, right? Like in
yeah,
just sort of across the board.
across
Yeah.
the board.
Yeah, I mean, a really good place to start is always with your data, right? Um, I'm a big fan of quantitative surveys, right? Having really thoughtful questions relating to diversity, equity, and inclusion, but then pairing that with a really robust demographic question set. So many organizations that we chat with have only gender data or only race data or maybe only age, and
Mhm.
like that doesn't get you anywhere, right? Like we're all more than just our age. We're more than just our gender,
Of
right? We're all
course.
like really complex beings, and we all have multiple and intersecting identities. So um, get your people's data, build that trust, and get that data, and understand what's actually going on, and where the fires really are at. Because once you have that, then you can actually be really strategic. From our perspective, we don't want organizations to have to spend tons of money. We'd rather give them like 3 really clear areas that they need to focus on for the next 6 months or 2 years. And the best way to do that is getting input from your people.
I love it. I love it. Before let's get to like, what are some of your closing thoughts? I know we're coming to the top of the hour, so like, what are some of your closing thoughts on what people should be doing when they should be reaching out to Sarah? How they should handle even when they have a crisis within their organization. What should be some of the steps they should take? Overall, how would you close up this conversation? Because there's a lot of content and a lot of tactical stuff that I thank you for sharing.
Yeah, I'd say every organization is going through their own version of it right now, because at the end of the day, diversity, equity, inclusion related work this is just social justice work that's, we've renamed and translated into like a palatable way, right, for organizations to actually sort of hear and engage with. And so it's not going to be easy. It's actually really messy. It's going to get weird, and that's okay. I think a lot of organizations are worried about doing things perfectly, and there is no sort of perfect path with this. And in fact, I'd say it's also, I find it a bit disheartening sometimes, because we see so many really thoughtful tech leaders who are, all about innovation and iteration and, pivoting and all these great words. Yeah, they don't apply those principles to how they approach their diversity and inclusion efforts, right? It's not gonna be perfect. You're gonna have to iterate.
You should do it the same way. And I think
Totally.
one of the things being a CEO is like, if I roll something out for my employees, it better be perfect, because you don't want to ruin their experience, and you don't want to do anything to harm them or break the way you're working, or even be scared to be like, hey, I may open Pandora's box of the unknown. But it's okay if you put your heart and intent in the right place. Your employees will come on the journey with you, and they know you won't get it right the first time, and that's okay.
Totally. And I think like building out really like, the most like the best possible channels, right, for people to give you that feedback in real time. I think as leaders, one of the smallest things that they can do to make things a lot easier for themselves and the rest of the organization is to not get so defensive, right? Like, you're going to hear all of the things right now. That's okay. Like when you really kick off these types of journeys in an intentional way, not everyone's going to be happy. That's okay. I'd rather you start somewhere and you move forward, right? Than let the idea or the fear of, not doing it perfectly, or that you're going to get called out, to stop you from even trying in the first place.
Sure. What about with technology? What's your closing on technology? We talked about AI tech. What in closing, what would you like to summarize about all the stuff that we've just talked about?
I think that, oh gosh, an technology, like another app, like that's not going to save us. It's not going to correct for, years of systemic and inequities and the ways that people are hurting. We have to remember that we're in the initial stages of AI and zeros and ones, and we need to view it as that, right? Something that's very much in its infancy. And yeah, I think that's a huge piece, that technology and innovation will only be sort of powerful when everyone's actually empowered by it. And we're a very long way away from that right now.
I talking to you, and most of the times when I talk to you about these things, I gotta say I'm very optimistic of what the future is going to hold. I think most and majority leaders in organizations want to do and do the right thing, and really, lead with their heart in the right way. And they just have been taught and almost programmed to do things a certain way, and they got to come out of their comfort zone to go and do this. And I think with more and more people working with you and listening to you, and others who actually, talk about D&I initiatives in this way, really start to wake up. A lot of the executives who listen to this podcast and say, hey, there's more we can do, and where we need to start there. So Sarah, I want to thank you so much for joining us, but I don't want to let you off the hook on that restaurant. I'll give you like a second to go Google the restaurant name.
Oh gosh. Yeah. Powwow Cafe,
Powwow
213 Augusta Avenue.
All right. Well, it's a date. You're taking me there. You just got to let me know when you take some time off your busy work schedule to eat, but I'm buying. Let's go do it.
Deal.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks, Dr. Sarah Saska from Femininity. You can catch her at, what's your website?
www.feminuity.org.
There you go. Thanks for tuning in to the First Name Basis podcast. And thanks, everyone, for listening. Have a great day.